So welcome to today's Tech Hour. It's Thursday, the 9th of June, and the title is Learning Platforms, Books to Containers, Euclid to Katacoda. You've probably not heard of Katacoda before, but I'll introduce him. And I'll just sort of give a bit of a brief introduction. So perhaps the first learning platform was the book. And Euclid's Elements consisted of 13 books, and if you wanted a copy of Euclid's Element, you would ask your scribe to make a copy for you. They were hand copied. And it was written about 300 years before the Common Era. Now today, a learning platform is a posh word for a library of digital interactive books. That's what I'm going to define it to be, and I hope they're going to be accessible. So in the past 50 years, we've got cheap computing and the internet, and the nature of learning has changed. And then the COVID pandemic has accelerated that change quite considerably. And last week, completely by chance, I discovered a new interactive learning and training platform for software engineers. And it's called Katacoda. I'll put the link in the URL in the chat. And I'm encouraging people to explore it. What really interested me about Katacoda was that in late 2019, O'Reilly published it. O'Reilly started as publishers of Unix manuals and documentation, and then started producing the famous Animal books on all manner of open source software. And last month, O'Reilly announced that the public use of the Katacoda platform will end and will be shuttered a week from yesterday. And the reason for that is because they want to focus it and develop it for their own use. Are we okay so far? So what's interesting about O'Reilly, as I said, is it's starting as a publishing company, and now its focus has completely changed, although it's still doing the same business of providing learning materials for software engineers. So I've signed up for Katacoda, and I created a small learning experience, which I'm going to show you, but I'll introduce you a few more things first. So I'm going to do some screen sharing. Share screen. Here we go. So here's the home page for Katacoda, and at the top you can see the announcement. I'll just quickly walk you through it. So it provides a lot of technologies that it provides, allows you to learn. And the key thing about it is that it provides you with a virtual machine or a container, that's pretty much the same thing, on which you can actually do things in practice. So unlike the old manuals that O'Reilly used to produce, where it said, if you type this, then you'll get this. And they even had a special notation in their books for showing this sort of input and output. You can actually type it yourself and see it yourself, and you still have the computer there, so you can ask questions as you go along. So you have access to the whole computing environment, but particular commands are made available to you as part of the learning experience. So it offers lots of free courses, so that will be shuttered fairly shortly. And they've got a lot on Docker, and a scenario is a lesson that takes 5, 10, 15, perhaps 20 minutes. And Kubernetes is something for orchestrating containers, and more on Kubernetes, machine learning, Linux and operating systems, continuous integration, continuous delivery, observability and analysis. I don't know what that is. Orchestration and application definition. Or a lot of this is about cloud computing. Cloud computing is both the enabling technology and one of the main technologies being taught. So networking. So to provide networking, it's nice to be able to set up multiple machines and have them talking to each other and not talking to each other. Cloud security, serverless, cloud platforms and management, infrastructure automation, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I don't even know what that is, but it's got 56 scenarios. So I've got an opportunity to do about 10 hours learning there. So let me move now to what O'Reilly said regarding what they're going to use Katacoda for. So they want to deliver critical tech skills to their 2.8 million members. So they no longer have readers, they have members of their learning platform. And at the time they wrote the post, they have nearly 900 scenarios powered by Katacoda, which doesn't sound like a large number. It's getting on for 1,000, so it's quite a bit. A lot of it will depend on the quality, of course. It's very easy to create 900 very similar and not very good scenarios. It's quite difficult to create one good scenario. And they're incorporating it into live training events. And apparently 400,000 people have been using it for a total of 74,000 hours. And I have to say that I am now one of them. And I've contributed an interactive scenario, although it falls into the not particularly good area rather than the very good area. And they've decided to, if not bet the company, at least have the company depend quite firmly on Katacoda. And we'll come to that at the end of the talk, when I talk about how to be an author or supplier for O'Reilly. So the next thing is something I talked about a few weeks ago, which is using Git without commit. And I created a bash shell, a bash script, so that I could do a demonstration live. And I'm going to scroll through just a little bit. And we start by initting, creating some Git repositories, Git init. And then I store some files. And then I write a tree. And then we tag the tree. And that's pretty much as far as I've got in terms of the interactive scenario. So I'm now going to move over to my GitHub repository, where, now this is really interesting, which is when I signed up to be an author for Katacoda, it said, would you like us to set up a repository for you in your GitHub account? And we will set it up so it's linked to Katacoda. And every time you make a push, we'll publish it on Katacoda. And I thought, yeah, I'll try that. So I did that. And now every time I make a change to the repository on GitHub, it gets pushed live so that it's live on Katacoda. And I can even make the changes within GitHub, because GitHub allows me to edit files. I'll just show you myself doing that. It allows me to edit files without even having a computer. If I see a typo, I can change a typo and commit it just through the web browser. I think that's nice. Anyway, I'm going to cancel those changes. And we're now going to go to me on Katacoda. And there's a picture of me wearing a shirt very similar to the one I'm wearing now, because I like that sort of shirt. And I've got two scenarios. One is called Git without commit, and the other is the new scenario template, which is just a stub you use to get going with. So after I've got more scenarios here, I'll delete that one. But I believe that everything's going to be shuttered next week, so I'm not putting a big investment into it. Now, let me show you what this looks like as a learning experience. This is a mixture of my stuff and the template. So at the moment, we're just seeing template stuff, except I said this is intermediate, it's going to last 15 minutes. So I'm afraid that this is template material that hasn't been revised, but I'm going to start the scenario. And I'm going to make it a bit smaller so we can see everything. That should probably work. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that looks okay. So the left-hand side, what we've got here, Alice gets a tree of files and stores it in Git. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here in the sense that we can see this as somebody who wants to learn the technology. We can see this as it's a learning platform. How good is it as a learning platform? We can also see it as it's an authoring platform. What's it like as an authoring platform? But with Katacoda, you explain what's going on, and this is roughly speaking a tutorial. The basis of a tutorial is that everybody gets to the end and they succeed. And the more effort they put in understanding what's going on, the better it is. It's a bit like a sort of magic trick where to begin with, you don't understand it. And then you watch it a few times and you do understand it. So this is a sort of magic trick where files are going from Alice to Bob to Carol. And to begin with, you might not understand it. But to begin with, we're going to get some files from GitHub. So I'm going to click on this command, wget command. And on the right-hand side in the terminal, something will happen. Oh, no, it doesn't. I think what's happened is that because I've gone away, the virtual environment has gone away. So I'm going to reload the page and start the scenario. And now we have to wait for the environment to come back. Part of this, I think, is set up so that not too many people use this for mining cryptocurrency. Okay, so we've got some rubbish here. If I type date, which is a Unix command, it tells me what the date is. If I type ls, it'll say what files I've got. I don't have any. So this is a Unix shell. And if I click here, a command, the command I click on will be copied into the Unix shell. There we go. And it went by very quickly. It's created a file called main.zip. I'm skeptical, so I'll type ls, and I see that I've got a file called main.zip. Now I'm going to unzip it so that I get a tree of files. Again, I can ls, and I can ls. Okay, so now, okay, you can follow the steps even if you never seen Git before. It's just that they don't mean very much. But it might be enough to get you through something or to encourage you to learn further. And everybody's first use of something should be successful. That's a sort of principle. So I'm going to create, what's gone wrong here? Now
Jonathan, I'm finding that your input line is cut off at the bottom of my screen. I wonder if you type a Control-L in the right-hand screen, whether that will clear it, and then things will scroll downwards.
I think I'm going to have to restart this again because something has gone wrong. Okay, well, I'm glad it's not entirely myself at fault. I think I might be sending an unwanted key. I'm going to repeat what I've done already quickly. So there's the wget, there's the unzip. Can you see all that, Nelson?
The last sign I see ends in step 3.md, but the cursor where your input is happening is off screen for me. And I've got the Zoom session set to full screen display.
Does that work better for you? Does it come back now?
I now see 2 blank lines under the step 3.md.
How's that?
That's better. Now that I can see the blinking cursor 2 lines below step 3.
Right, and you've just got the date.
Yes. No, fine. Thank you.
Excellent. So now I'm going to create the bare Git repository. And if we go through here, we're going to look inside that repository and we see that it's got the stuff that you usually see in a .git file. It doesn't have what's called a working directory, which is perhaps something I should explain to people that know Git, but don't explain to people that don't know Git. This is a case where a bit of knowledge of Git is a nuisance. So now I'm going to add some files to that Git repository. And if I do ls.ls.git, oh, it's gone and frozen again. Well, I'm glad I'm not paying for this. I'm going to stop in a couple of minutes so that Caroline has a chance to ask some questions before she goes. In fact, anyone can ask questions while Katacoda is preparing an environment for me.
The main thing for me, I think, it's just like getting a link to this to play with it for the next week to see if I actually want to pay for it once it becomes a pay for.
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't want to provide me with an environment and let me keep it. Maybe
well, you know, that's mainly because you're trying to demo it in a meeting.
Yeah, that could be it. So
I always find it happens in meetings.
Here's one I prepared earlier. Okay, so I showed you I added files from Katacoda examples main, the zip file we created, and I wrote a tree. Oh, sorry. I added the files. So sorry. Now I write the tree. I get this long number here, which is the secret name for the tree, and that stores it in the shell variable hash. And now it's frozen again, so I'm going to give up on this. But the next two steps are to tag the tree and show that I can access the files through the tag. In other words, prove that I've really stored the files that I downloaded in the tree. Now, I'm going to go back to what we've got. So this was my starting point, which is something you can read and something you can run as a script, but it's not something you can interact with. All you can do is run it and say, oh, isn't that wonderful? But you can't sort of pause it and have a look at what's going on. And other things like that. Each has got its advantages. So I think that I'm going to stop now because I promised Carolyn role of honor in terms of saying a piece or asking questions before departing.
Well, like I said, I'm just kind of, I know this had something to do with accessibility for this Katacoda, which I feel like I probably need to play with this a little bit to get more of an idea of what's going on with it.
Yeah, I think so.
It looks like a straightforward teaching tool.
I think it's designed for small examples. It's designed to teach people in 10 minutes. Somebody's got 10 minutes to learn something, yeah, the fact that you're working at a real machine, I think, makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
I think you can look at it from where you are. You can look at it as a learning platform.
Yeah, and so was that in the email, the link for that?
I'll send the links after the meeting.
Okay.
Some of these links are newly created. So after the meeting, I'll send you links. I'll send the links to everyone. Are you speaking? I can't hear you.
No, I wasn't saying anything. I was just kind of looking there because, yeah, you do have a link to the Katacoda actually in the meeting invite.
I'll send the links to the other items after the meeting. The accessibility thing, apart from the fact that it freezes without me knowing why or how, part of it is it's a sort of call and response thing, but you're not getting the responses under the calls. So I think there's a sort of, if you're blind, it's going to be difficult navigating from one window to the other and finding where you are, I suspect.
Yeah,
not losing your place.
And I may play with my NVDA player, just or screen reader, to see how that, because it's got two modes. One's actually for browsing things that with fill-in forms, and it generally will tell you everything you're in. But
well, look, if you did a bit of that and just had something to say and you posted it to the visually impaired programmers list, that would be very much appreciated.
Okay, I'll try to find some time tomorrow morning at least to play with it.
Yeah. And if it doesn't happen, well, at least you've learned something.
Yeah. Yeah, and it might teach me something about what I'm trying to do now with their own tools.
I think the main part about Katacoda, and this is something I'm sure Nelson will agree with, is that when you're doing what is roughly called Linux sysadmin, you can't learn it without having a machine to administer.
Mm-hmm.
You can do book learning, but there's the practical learning involved, and really you have to have an actual machine to administer, but it could be a virtual machine and that works just as well. And the great thing about Katacoda and anything container-based, which is what we were talking about last week, is that you get this reproducible environment. Just as when you print 50 copies or 100 copies of the Bible, they're all identical. So when you create 50 containers using the same recipe, they're all identical. In fact, they're more identical than the cookies you get from a cookie cutter. You know, they're more identical than peas in a pod. And that's a great help when it comes to giving a stable learning experience.
Well, thanks for this, and I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of this later on. I've got to head off to my next meeting.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye. So I think I finished my demonstration. Can I stop the share? We can put it back again if we need it. Yeah. So I find this whole thing very interesting. And if I've taken it away. The input file is written using Markdown with a few proprietary extensions that allow the magic buttons to be created. And then you have a JSON file that sort of assembles that provides the role of a manifest and a table of contents. Just to get the discussion going, I found that the cloud technology aspect of Katacoda looked to be good, though I was a bit disappointed at the freezing that I seem to experience, and that the user experience is fair to good. The authoring environment, I think, has flaws, but the one thing that the authoring environment seems to be very strong at is guidelines for authors. This is the language to use, editorial advice. The authoring guidelines have got a lot of editorial advice that's related, I think, to, on the one hand, usability, and on the other hand, the O'Reilly use of it as a platform. Newspapers, for example, have style guides, as do many publishers. I think there's something called the Oxford Comma, and there's the Chicago style for bibliographies. So O'Reilly is certainly investing in style, and it's investing heavily in this platform. I'll mention that O'Reilly has a page where you can say, I want to be an author for O'Reilly, and it gives 3 opportunities. The first is interactive training events, probably online, although I guess not necessarily. And you write your proposal and you say, here are the Jupyter notebooks I intend to use, and here are the Katacoda examples I'm intending to use. So that's one sort of opportunity they provide. The second sort of opportunity they provide is, I think they call them scenarios, authoring Katacoda scenarios. And they can go, I think that they could probably publish one in 6 weeks. You submit a proposal and 6 weeks later it's published. They can do a very quick turnaround, I think, on that sort of thing. And then the third one is the traditional book. So these are the 3 avenues, if you like, to becoming an O'Reilly content provider. And only one of those leads to the traditional animal books. So I'll stop at that point. I think there's a lot to take in here. Let me tell a little story, which is I discovered this in an interesting way. For last week's meeting, I thought I wanted to learn something about Podman, because I've never heard about it before. And I knew it did something similar to Docker, but I didn't exactly trust it. So I searched for a Podman tutorial and found one on Katacoda. And it allowed me to press some buttons and see things happening. And even though I was only pressing buttons, it was a real environment, if you like. I was really issuing commands. And that gave me some ideas as to what Podman did and how it worked, that otherwise I'd have to install and invent examples for myself. So for the sort of simple examples of how you use something, such as you might see in a television commercial, it's so easy. All you do is this and this and this. It certainly works well. And I think it works well for things where you've got complicated commands and you have to read them several times to understand what they're doing. So it gives you the opportunity to make sure you do the right command, but you do have to understand what the command is doing in order to get the learning experience. So I think there is a range of tasks, and Unix system administrators are not programmers, though they might program as another activity. So I think the sysadmin is perhaps well suited to the sort of scenarios that Katacoda is good at presenting. But for the tech community, it really is a different idea as to what learning is, and if you like, what the book is. So for O'Reilly, a book might be a suite of scenarios, just as a poetry book might be a collection of short poems. And the more theoretical stuff will be dealt with elsewhere. I'll stop at that point and ask Nelson if he'd like to add something.
Well, I first heard of Katacoda only in last week's Tech Office Hour, so this is all very new to me, and I have never actually used any kind of an online learning system, so I have to confess to being largely a novice here. I certainly can see the utility for things like this. What worries me about this technology and many other kinds is they tend to be ephemeral. Companies make decisions to support a product for a period, and then they drop the product, destroy it, and it disappears completely, and the effort people have put into learning it has been wasted. We had a major campus situation at my university a few years ago when an online learning system that was undoubtedly paid for to the tune of several $1 million was adopted, ran for a few years, and then was abandoned. And all of the work that had gone into preparing lessons in that system was completely lost. People had to simply start over and regenerate systems in the new, or lessons rather, in the new system. And I felt that was a terrible tragedy. And so I complained bitterly about it. And I was assured that under the new system, there was an agreement between the customers and the producer that should the producer go out of business, the customers would own the software. And so the learning system would not disappear. But who knows what will happen with Katacoda. It may be a long-lived system that one can rely on for decades. But it also could be that corporate decides a year from now that we're going to do something completely different, and it gets tossed.
Well, O'Reilly have said that it's not an open source system. The Katacoda is a platform. It's not open source. It publishes material that is open source. I found a repository that contained a whole bunch of Red Hat Enterprise Linux lessons, although whether they were actually from Red Hat or not, I don't know. But it relies on public GitHub repositories a great deal for developing the platform. But now the Katacoda content providers, of which I am now one, I have a voice, a small voice, are being unplatformed. The stuff that we have created in our GitHub repositories will no longer be available through katacoda.com. Now, on the one hand, that's a threat. On the other hand, it's an opportunity in the sense of, well, I quite like what Katacoda has done, but I can't buy it in the way that O'Reilly's does it. But I can create an analogous platform which is open source and so has the benefits and the demerits associated with that. So what really interested me about Katacoda is that O'Reilly is willing to put money into it and to invest heavily into it, which is in some sense a vote of endorsement for the platform, which includes both the technology and the architecture, if you like, the social architecture, perhaps. So it's one of these online learning platforms, and it's for a particular audience. I think it's for the people that do the people who are developing cloud computing skills and keeping up with the new technologies. So they're eating their own dog food in this respect. I think as an authoring environment, it's not nearly as sophisticated as LaTeX, and I've found that I was making small errors. It was hard to correct errors, and the idea that this stuff could easily be translated. There's no support for easy translation of the documents, and something I really felt was there are two things going on. There are the commands you're issuing, which absolutely have to be correct, and they have to be written by somebody who knows the technology. And then there's the pedagogic description, which might even depend on the context. The pedagogic description certainly depends on the language of the user, so you could write it in French or German. But it might also depend on the context in which it's being used. So you might have a series of exercises or buttons to press, and in one context you'll have one explanation, in another context you have a different explanation. But there seems to be no support for mixing that sort of thing. However, this is a commercial system, and people are struggling. Ronald Reagan, somebody's supposed to have said to Ronald Reagan, your last picture wasn't very good. And he's supposed to be said they didn't want it very good, they wanted it Friday. In other words, they're working in time constraints, and also, even though they are commercial companies, financial constraints. I'm not in a position where I can worry about the learning systems my university provides in the way that you do, and I'm glad that you take advantage of the opportunity you have.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly prepared to have people go to the effort of preparing the lessons in Katacoda. It remains to be seen how broad a user base that gets adopted. You can find, for example, on YouTube, plenty of tutorials on how to bake cookies and repair your bicycle and so on, and make videos of funny cats. And so far, those are all free, albeit interspersed with advertising. Perhaps the Katacoda approach, if it gets big enough and widely adopted enough, will have a big enough user base that the publisher will want to keep it available indefinitely. And one might hope that should they ever decide to replace it, they will provide a translation facility that will automatically move files from the old system to new. That didn't happen in the case of our university. Everything was thousands of instructors lost probably hundreds to thousands of hours of work because the whole system was abandoned and completely replaced with something that was totally incompatible and different. And that was very, very sad.
I used to work for the Open University, and they have a virtual learning environment, they call it. And they decided to go down the open source route, and they invested very heavily in Moodle. And I think it's worked well for them. And because I'm working in the same office as other people doing that sort of thing, I've picked up a certain amount through over osmosis and overhearing and that sort of thing. And the portability of learning objects across learning systems is an important issue. And in a sense, that's the problem that you had, was that the learning objects you created weren't portable. I'm interested in too many things, and one of the things I'm now also interested in is some sort of open source equivalent of Katacoda that might possibly run on your own machine. So the stuff we've done with DistroBox and Toolbox show this creating your own environment for running a Katacoda type example isn't that complicated, or shouldn't be that complicated. So that sort of gives you a sort of a large part of the platform if you've got a reasonably powerful PC of the Katacoda system. So there are it's an idea that I found quite interesting. The Learn LaTeX site created by the LaTeX 3 team, I don't know to what degree it would be possible to set that up on the Katacoda platform. I think it probably is possible because I've done some Docker examples where you set up the Docker stuff and then you go to an external website, or sort of, well, it's a Katacoda website, but it's supplied through Docker software that gives you a system monitor. So you can get a web page that shows the monitors your little system. So I see no reason why a Katacoda scenario can't allow you to create a document and preview it through a separate web page. Kelly's got something. So can I ask you to?
Sorry, I don't have a video today, but I do. You guys can hear me, right?
We can hear
Yes.
you very nicely.
Okay, great. So RStudio is a IDE for R, and they have what they call RStudio Connect, where you can have an instance of R in the cloud, and they provide so much per month for free accounts, or you can host your own server if you want to. And it allows you to run the R environment and then have interactive trainings or websites for people to do exactly what you're doing on this Katacoda, but just with R.
That sounds pretty good. There are similar things with Python. The python.org homepage has got a console you can type into. And there's a port of Python to WebAssembly. These are different things, but they're on the same they're on the same page. It seems from what I've heard that, thank you, Kelly, that you can run Python in RStudio Connect, you believe. I'm quite impressed at what R has got in terms of it being an up-to-date community. I was certainly very pleased that it allows Jonathan Godfrey to do so much as a blind lecturer in statistics. I thought that was a big endorsement for what the R community has done.
Yeah, unfortunately, RStudio itself is not very accessible, but R is. And our RStudio is just an IDE, so obviously you can get around that. But the benefit of this is that because R, you can install tidyverse and sorry, not tidyverse, TinyTech, I think is what they call it. I can't. Sorry, I'm the small instance of LaTeX that.
TinyTech.
Yes. So you can install TinyTech, and then you could use that to build any LaTeX document that you wanted, because then you also have access to Pandoc and a bunch of other things. So in theory, you could use RStudio Connect to have a dynamic environment that you could do lots more than just statistics in.
Yeah, there's been a sort of change, I think, from big is best to less is more, in the sense that if you only got one server, then you better make sure that you install on it all the software that everybody in your corporation wants. So you make sure that it's got a big hard disk, and the software that you want is there, even if the other server resources you might have to wait for. What's happened now, I think, is small containers that deploy quickly are more fashionable. So you have large amounts of stuff stored, and it's just moved to the right place for computation when it's needed. There's certainly a sort of very different model of computing when you use containers to the model that I sort of grew up when you had a server. And I think Nelson is nodding there, but if he speaks, he can explain why.
Yeah, well, that's the subject of an article that I'm putting together for Jonathan and me to submit to Tugboat to describe our experiments with toolboxes and containers, because I think this is an interesting development that has really only become available in the last couple of years. I mean, virtual machines have been around for decades, but easy to use containers where you can install not only a whole new operating system with a one-line command, but then install whatever packages you care to in that operating system, make for a powerful environment. You know, for example, in our environment here at a university, we have to pick a relatively stable distribution of an operating system for use by our thousands of users. And from time to time, they come in and say, could you please make available this other package? And we say, well, I'm sorry, it's just not available in the operating system we have. And we've tried to build it from source code, and there are just too many missing components. With a toolbox operating system, you could now say, well, it's not available on our default operating system, but we can give you a new operating system with a one-line command that lets you install the package yourself, and now you can use it to your heart's content. And that, I think, is a really exciting development and will solve many people's problems and making a lot more software available.
Yeah, I think it even goes further than that, that somebody can create a container. Somebody on their machine can solve the problems of getting such and such and such and such and such and such to work together. And having made one in their own kitchen, they can then make it again more carefully, following a recipe. And when the recipe works, they can publish that recipe on Docker Hub, and you can download the recipe, and it's exactly the same as downloading a different OS, if you like. It'll create a container with certain properties, and it won't be the Ubuntu 20.04 properties. It will be the particular properties you're interested in, which happen to be supported on Arch Linux or whatever it is.
Exactly.
So the reproducibility of virtual environments stroke containers has really shot up. The ability to publish a recipe for a container. So I can publish a recipe for a container, and somebody in another continent 5 minutes later can download it and reproduce the container. And
how much do you think that,
yeah, go on, Kelly.
I was just gonna say, how much do you think that these containers though make it where people aren't as careful with the code that they write? Because you're only making it, like, you're less focused on making it generalized to work on multiple operating systems and in multiple environments. And I just worry about it not being sustainable going forward as things develop?
I think that's a good point. And the quality of the code is important. And do you trust in the appropriate manner the person you supplied it to, who supplied it to you? So high quality things should be at a premium and are likely to be hard to find. But I can look at it a different way. I can say, I've got this problem in I'm using your software and I found this problem with it. I'll create a container that reproduces the problem as far as I'm concerned. And then by publishing that as the container that contains the problem, the developers of the software can reproduce the problem. So I'm not saying it's not a serious concern. I'm saying it cuts both ways, that containers, what's the word? It's like electronic trading. It reduces friction. Containers, in some sense, reduce friction, and whether that's good or bad depends. We've had some terrible disasters with roll-on, roll-off errors, and part of that is the internal nature of the boat. Means the water sloshes around and causes instability, and that sloshing around is a lack of friction. So friction can be very good. Friction is quite important for safety, but it's also a cost on machinery. So I'm not agreeing with you and I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying there are opportunities and you're saying there are risks, that's all. And we're both right.
Yeah. One problem that the containers solve is that very often people want to build their software package on another one. For example, the Boost library in C++, or a graphics library for a particular video card or so on. And often these packages are only available on a limited number of distributions. But with containers now, that means I really don't have to care, because somebody's already done the work of interfacing the container operating system to my operating system. And even if mine doesn't support the libraries that are needed for this new software, there's a container somewhere that does. And a one-line command brings it in, and the software is ready for me to use. And I think that's a really interesting development.
I'm going to make a statement, which is the introduction of alphabet meant that letters were reproducible. Right, an alpha is an alpha. And the introduction of printing meant that notices were reproducible.
And information can be shared to a much wider extent than previously.
Yeah, I read a book on the social history of print, and it pointed out that Luther didn't just nail his theses to the door of the cathedral, but they were published in thousands and thousands of copies. And that the history books dealing with that time didn't pay proper attention to the role that print had in the dissemination of Luther's views. So print was one of the major reproducible manufacturing technologies, and it started with the letter. So you cut the die, and from the die you stamped a mold, and from the mold you cast thousands and thousands of identical letter S's, or nearly identical letter S's, and you use those in your books. So this sort of identical reproducibility was quite important. And when we move to digital computation, identity becomes much more of an exact thing. Computers sort of do fail and do wear out, but when they're working properly, an S is an S is an S, and a T is a T is a T. Whereas if you're in print, the printing plates do wear, for example. And they do produce uneven impressions, and you get misprints and all sorts of stuff. Now, the containers, I think, the big thing about containers, I think, together with the internet and also Git, is that it makes it much easier to reproduce a machine effectively the same. So you and I and anyone else who wishes to can have a machine, i.e. an initiated container, that is the same as any other. And so any computation done on that machine should give the same result. So this sort of reproducibility of computation is, I think, one of the big things of containers. And Don Knuth was definitely a pioneer in that, because in his first version of Tech, he used the floating point capabilities of the machine in order to control line breaking, in order to do line breaking calculations, and found that on different machines you get different results sometimes. So he redid all that code to use fixed point arithmetic only, so that one of his goals was that when you typeset a document with Tech, if the inputs are identical, the outputs would be effectively identical. And I see containers as a step in that same direction, but it's a lightweight solution that does close to the minimum necessary, rather than virtual machines, which are rather heavyweight and awkward. Putting some of my experience together, and I'm repeating from last week, the containers protect the host from the guest. And the original form of the container was the root, which prevented the process from escaping its sandbox, or at least making it hard for it to escape its sandbox. So the container protects the host from the guest. The virtual machine, in some sense, protects the guest from the host, because the host can say, we're going to close this machine down in 20 minutes for essential engineering work, including the replacement of a power supply. And the guest can say, oh, well, thank you for telling me that. I'll just move my virtual machine across the hall to another machine, to another host. So it allows the machines to go from host to host. And I think only containers will support, only virtual machines will support that. I think the other thing about virtual machines is this, that containers, on one machine running many containers, the containers are sharing a single kernel. Now, as far as I can tell, they're all sharing the same kernel. They have different init processes, but they're sharing the same kernel. Which means that it's not a very good platform if you're a kernel developer. But if you're a kernel developer, virtual machines are great.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Yeah. I would make one more comment about Luther's leaflets, and that is that the wider accessibility to printed material greatly raised the interest on the general public to learning to read. Before print was widely available, you would rely on your local priest or scribe to write a letter and read a letter for you, and you didn't have to learn to read yourself. But suddenly, when printed material can be handed out to everyone, it's in their own self-interest to learn to read. And I think that was a really significant thing in making education an almost universal expectation by roughly the 17 and 1800s in much of the more developed world.
William Tyndale was executed for printing the Bible. I think that's a fair summary in 4 words.
Was that because he made a version that the authorities disapproved of, or they wanted a monopoly and he broke the monopoly?
He broke the monopoly.
Uh-huh.
There is the famous Wicked Bible, a few copies of which still exist, which omitted the word "not" from a few commands.
Thou shalt steal.
That's the idea. Okay, I think this is good. I will miss you next week and the week after, Nelson, but have a lovely holiday and you deserve it.
Yeah, and I'm hoping in a day or so I'll get you a PDF of what I've been writing.
Oh,
and if we can come to a general agreement, we can get it off to the tugboat editors fairly quickly.
Well, we might want to
think it's a lesson we want to get exposed to the tech community as quickly as we can.
Well, you might want to give a talk.
A good way.
You might want to give a talk at the tech conference.
Probably isn't time for me to do that. With travel in June and possibly also July, I just don't have time to work on a talk for this year's conference.
You have higher standards for talks than I do, but I respect you for that.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is all quite interesting, and there's something that has struck me very strongly, which is that the ability of Katacoda to link my repository to theirs and thereby set up a publishing mechanism struck me very strongly. What struck me first of all is I knew nothing about this. I had no idea that such things were possible or how to do it. But for example, if we think about CTAN, lots of people that contribute to CTAN have Git accounts. And if CTAN had a Git account, it could put in a hook so that whenever there was a commit, it will get published on CTAN. That sort of thing can happen. And I think it would be really helpful if we, in the tech community, recognized and valued these external skills and had people within them that formed a pool of expertise, if you like. And these people needn't be the usual suspects learning a new trade. They could be people such as in the R community, where they're in a different community, but they've got something to contribute to ours. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole group of people doing databases in mathematics, and they obviously require various computing skills. But because they're mathematicians, they also require certain tech skills, and they may be able to bring things into our community. And the accessibility group should have a similar sort of property of people from outside our community who provide a source of expertise that helps us with our work in return for our helping them with our work. Or even just they recognize that they can do good here, so they do good. And we recognize we can do good there, so we do good there. That's my tuppence worth on this.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm about ready to get off to lunch and then return to proofreading. I was getting my ideas down as fast as I could, but I'm a terrible typist and I make lots of fumble-fingered mistakes, and so I have to proofread carefully. But I hope I can present something to you in a day or so that's readable and largely correct.
I very much look forward to it. I very much look forward to it.
Yeah.
So until we meet again, and thank you for listening in, Philip. Your support has been gratefully received.